Be in BC, this
and trying to figure out
jobs in manufacturing and construction.
Jobs report. But if we look at the numbers,
helping businesses, but also on workers.
That Donald Trump has been squeezing with tariffs and openly teasing about becoming the 51st state. That country is Canada. And instead of firing back, instead of matching the pressure with pressure, its Prime Minister, Mark Carney, sends fighter jets into the American sky, lights up one of the most famous natural wonders on the continent in red, white, and blue, and hands over 250 living maple trees as a birthday gift. So the question I keep circling back to, the one I want you to hold on to as we walk through all of this together, is deceptively simple. Is this diplomacy? Or is it a nation quietly disarming its rival with nothing but kindness? Let me set the scene for you, because the details here matter, and the more I looked at them, the more I realized this was not a throwaway ceremonial moment. On the 4th of July, as the United States marked its semi-quincentennial, its 250th year since declaring independence, Canada did not stand quietly on the sidelines. It leaned in. And it leaned in hard, with a coordinated series of gestures that felt less like a polite neighborly nod and more like a carefully choreographed statement of intent. When I read through what Canada actually did that day, I stopped thinking of it as a birthday card and started thinking of it as a message, one written in symbols instead of sentences, and aimed squarely at both Washington and the Canadian public watching back home. Start with the sky. 2 Canadian CF-18 Hornets flew alongside 2 American F-35s in a joint military flypast. Now, I want you to sit with that image for a second, because it is loaded with meaning. Military aircraft from 2 nations flying wing to wing over a border is not a casual thing. It is a display that takes planning, coordination, trust between defense establishments, and a shared willingness to be seen together in front of the world. Fighter jets are, by their nature, symbols of power and protection. And here they were, Canadian and American, side by side, at the exact moment when the political relationship between these two governments is arguably the most strained it has been in a generation. That contrast, jets in formation above, tariffs and threats on the ground below, is the whole story in a single frame. Then there is Niagara Falls. Canada lit the falls up in red, white, and blue, the colors of the American flag, to honor the anniversary. And if you have ever stood in front of Niagara, you know it is not a small canvas. It is thunderous, enormous, one of the most recognizable landmarks shared between the two countries, straddling the border itself. Choosing to bathe it in American colors on America's birthday is the kind of gesture that plays beautifully on camera, that spreads across screens instantly, that says we see you, we honor you, we are celebrating with you.
Continue to melt.
Well, we will continue to keep an eye on it. Thank you both for joining us on our political panel. We look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks. Have fun out there.
Thank you.
It is soft power in its purest visual form. And again, I keep noticing the timing. This warmth is being broadcast at precisely the moment the trade relationship is frozen solid. And then comes the gift that I think got the most attention, and honestly, the one I find the most quietly clever. 250 maple trees. 1 tree for each year of American independence. And these are not being dropped in a single ceremonial garden and forgotten. According to the plan, they are to be planted in the United States Capitol and across the 13 American states that share a border with Canada. Think about what that means. 250 living things, rooted in American soil, spread along the very boundary that these two nations share, in the capital city where the decisions about tariffs and trade and sovereignty are being made.
Delicate interplay with Daniel Smith to watch out for, though, insofar as...
Despite her help, it hasn't been so helpful
Exactly.
so far.
Yeah, how does that play?
The maple, of course, is the enduring emblem of Canada. So in a very real sense, Canada is planting itself, permanently, visibly, along the American border and in the heart of Washington as a gift. Trees outlive administrations. Trees outlive trade disputes. Trees outlive the news cycle. And I do not think that symbolism was accidental for a single moment. Alongside all of this, Prime Minister Mark Carney issued a formal statement to mark the occasion. And this is where the gesture stops being purely ceremonial and starts revealing its edges. Because Carney chose his words with real care. He reached back into history and quoted Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and specifically a line from 1936 describing the border between the two countries as a monument to peace. Now, on the surface, that is a lovely, generous thing to say. It is the language of friendship, of a border that has stood for generations without conflict, of two peoples who have chosen cooperation over rivalry. But read it again in the context of this exact moment, and it starts to feel like something more pointed. Because the man Carney is effectively addressing, Donald Trump, has been the one repeatedly floating the idea of Canada becoming the 51st state, of erasing that very border, of treating a sovereign nation as though it were an unfinished part of the American project. So when Carney quotes a line about the border as a monument to peace, he is doing two things at once. He is offering warmth, yes, but he is also very gently and very deliberately reminding everyone that the border exists, that it has meaning, that it represents peace precisely because it separates two sovereign nations that respect one another. It is, and I said this earlier and I stand by it, a pointed message wrapped inside a birthday card. It is the diplomatic equivalent of smiling warmly while making absolutely certain the other person understands where the line is drawn. And the choice to use Roosevelt, an American president, to make that point about the sanctity of the border is itself a masterstroke.
Business Insider, and Ben, it's kind of a tariff yo-yo this week, so I'm going to summarize it. Yes, tariffs, wait, not for Mexico, wait, not for cars, yes, for Canada, wait, no.
Carney is not lecturing America with Canadian words. He is holding up America's own history, its own revered figures, and letting those words do the work. Now, let me get to the part that I think most people skated right past. Because to me, this is where the real tension lives, and it is the reason this whole story is worth your time. All of this warmth, the jets, the falls, the trees, the eloquent quotes about peace and friendship, all of it is happening while American tariffs on Canadian goods remain firmly, immovably in place. We are talking about tariffs on Canadian steel, on aluminum, on automobiles, and on lumber. These are not minor categories. These are the industrial backbone of the trade relationship between the two nations. The sectors that employ hundreds of thousands of people, that feed factories and supply chains on both sides of that border, everyone keeps calling a monument to peace. And those tariffs did not pause for the party. They did not soften for the anniversary. They stayed exactly where they were, generating real economic strain, real friction, real frustration, even as the maple trees were being loaded up as gifts. And on top of the tariffs, there is the rhetoric. Trump has kept floating this idea of Canada as the 51st state, and I want to be clear about how that lands north of the border, because it is easy for people to hear it as a joke or a provocation and move on. For many Canadians, that kind of talk is not funny. It touches something deep. It touches national identity, sovereignty, the sense of being a distinct country with its own history and its own future, rather than a region waiting to be absorbed.
But it's a solid base, and that solid base is showing up to hear Poilievre's greatest slogan hits.
Here's the thing about massive rallies, though. They are a huge drawdown.
So imagine being a Canadian citizen, watching your government send fighter jets and living maple trees and beautiful words to a president who keeps suggesting your entire country should simply cease to exist as an independent nation and fold into his. That is the emotional whiplash at the center of this story. Generosity flowing one way, pressure and provocation flowing the other. This is exactly why the reactions to Canada's gestures split so sharply. And honestly, that split is the story as much as the gestures themselves. On one side, you had Americans who were genuinely moved, and I understand that completely. If you set aside the politics for a moment and just look at the gestures, they are touching. A neighbor showing up on your birthday with jets in the sky, your landmark lit in your colors, and a gift of living trees meant to outlast all of you. That is a beautiful thing. Plenty of Americans saw it exactly that way, as a warm and gracious act from a friend, a reminder that beneath all the political noise, the bond between these two peoples runs deep and runs real. And I do not want to dismiss that reaction because there is truth in it. But on the other side, you had a very different response, and it came largely from Canadians themselves. Many looked at the whole spectacle and called it what they saw as a public relations move. Their argument goes something like this. How can we be sending gifts and staging warm displays for a government that is actively taxing our steel, our aluminum, our cars, and our lumber, and openly talking about swallowing our country whole? To them, the maple trees and the light show and the fly past looked less like sincere friendship and more like a performance, a bit of image management dressed up as diplomacy, while the actual relationship, the one measured in tariffs and trade balances and jobs, stays bruised and unresolved. And I think that skepticism deserves to be taken seriously because it is coming from the people who are living inside the consequences of the trade dispute, not just watching it from the outside. So which reading is right? Is this heartfelt generosity, or is it strategic theater? And here is where I land after turning it over and over. I think it is genuinely both, and I think the fact that it can be both at the same time is what makes it so interesting. Great diplomacy is very often sincere and calculated in the same breath. You can mean the warmth and still deploy it strategically. Carney can genuinely value the friendship between the two nations, and at the very same moment, understand that projecting that warmth publicly puts pressure on Trump in a way that shouting never could. Because think about the position it creates. When you respond to tariffs and annexation talk with maple trees and quotes about peace, you make it very difficult for the other side to keep playing the aggressor without looking petty. You are, in effect, seizing the moral high ground and planting a flag on it. Or rather, planting 250 trees on it. That is the deeper game I see underneath all of this. Canada is publicly betting on the long game. It is wagering that the long-term friendship between these two nations matters more than the short-term bruises of a trade war, and it is willing to absorb some domestic criticism and some economic pain in the near term in order to protect that longer relationship. It is choosing dignity over retaliation. And there is real strategy in that choice, because retaliation is exactly what escalation feeds on. Every tit-for-tat move gives the other side a reason to go further. But kindness, generosity, warmth, those are much harder to escalate against. You cannot easily pick a fight with a country that just gave you a gift on your birthday and lit up a waterfall in your colors. Carney appears to understand that and to be using it. But, and this is a real but, generosity has its limits and it has its risks. The obvious danger of this approach is that warmth, on its own, does not lower a single tariff. It does not reopen a frozen negotiation. It does not protect a steelworker or a lumber mill or an auto plant from the economic pressure they are feeling right now. Symbolism is powerful, but symbolism does not pay the bills. And so the very real question hanging over all of this is whether these goodwill gestures actually translate into anything concrete at the negotiating table, or whether they remain simply a dignified posture while the trade talks stay stuck exactly where they are. That is the test. That is what separates clever diplomacy from a beautiful but empty performance. Do the trees buy any softening, or do they just look good on camera while the tariffs grind on? And that is precisely what I am watching for next, and what I would urge you to watch for too. The real measure of whether this strategy worked will not be the applause on the 4th of July. It will be whatever happens in the weeks and months that follow, in the rooms where trade officials actually sit down across from one another. Does Washington respond to the warmth with any flexibility on steel, on aluminum, on autos, on lumber? Does the 51st state rhetoric quiet down, even a little, in the wake of such a public display of Canadian goodwill?
That Canada should tax them, and should tax them in a way that drives Trump crazy and is certain to be responded to in the next round of tariffs, I expect.
Or does the goodwill simply evaporate the moment the cameras move on, leaving Canada exactly where it started, only slightly poorer in maple trees? Because if the tariffs stay, and the rhetoric continues, and the talks remain frozen, then the skeptics will have been proven right, and this will go down as a lovely gesture that changed nothing. But if there is even a modest thaw, if there is a softening, then Carney will have pulled off something genuinely shrewd, winning ground not by pushing back, but by refusing to. There is also a longer historical lens worth holding up here, because moments like this do not exist in a vacuum. The relationship between these two nations has always been described in the language of the world's longest undefended border, of deep integration, of shared values, and intertwined economies. That FDR quote Carney reached for, the border as a monument to peace, is famous precisely because it captured something true and enduring about how these two countries have coexisted.
For that province, but it will require, I think, some I guess, fancy tap dancing on the part of both Poilievre and Carney to see how they do.
And by invoking it right now, in the middle of tariffs and annexation talk, Carney is essentially asking a question of his own. He is asking whether that vision of the relationship, the one built on peace and mutual respect and a border that unites rather than divides, still holds. He is holding up the ideal and, without ever saying it directly, asking the current American administration whether it intends to live up to it or walk away from it. That is a remarkably subtle piece of messaging, and I think it is easy to miss just how much weight is packed into a single historical reference.
Play with voters elsewhere in the country. Look, but to me, that national unity has been put on the table by Western provincial leaders is super interesting, because in Quebec.
What strikes me most, stepping all the way back, is how this entire episode captures a truth about how nations actually deal with one another in tense times. We tend to imagine international pressure as loud. Threats, sanctions, angry statements, retaliatory measures. And a lot of it is exactly that. But some of the most effective pressure is quiet. It is generous. It is gracious. It puts the other party in a position where the aggressive path suddenly carries a social and reputational cost it did not have before. By responding to hostility with hospitality, Canada may be attempting to change the terms of the entire confrontation, to shift it from a contest of who can push harder into a contest of who can be more gracious.
I don't think that would be incorrect to say that Republicans on the Hill would like a little bit more certainty as well, which isn't to say that they're standing up to President.
A contest Canada clearly believes it can win. And whether you find that admirable or manipulative probably says as much about you as it does about the strategy. Both readings are defensible. That is what makes it fascinating. So let me bring it all back to where we started, to that question I asked you to hold on to. On one hand, we have a country facing tariffs.
Yeah. All right. We'll be watching for that. Ben, great to have you. Thank you so much for taking us through all of that. Boris?
So we've discussed the economic impacts. Let's talk about the political impacts.
On its steel, its aluminum, its automobiles, and its lumber, facing repeated talk of being absorbed as a 51st state and choosing to respond with fighter jets flying in friendship, a waterfall lit in its neighbor's colors, 250 living trees planted along the shared border and in the capital, and words about peace borrowed from America's own history. On the other hand, we have a domestic audience at home wondering whether their government is being dignified or being naive, generous, or simply performing generosity while the real fight stays lost. The gestures were undeniably beautiful, the strategy behind them was undeniably clever, and the outcome, whether any of it actually moves the tariffs or thaws the talks, is still completely unwritten. Is this diplomacy at its most sophisticated? A nation choosing grace as a weapon because grace is harder to fight? Or is it a country doing the only dignified thing it can while it waits, powerless, for a trade war it did not start to finally end? Maybe it is a nation disarming its rival with pure kindness, betting that warmth today buys respect tomorrow. Or maybe it is a lovely gesture destined to be remembered as exactly that, a gesture and nothing more. I genuinely do not think we know yet. And that uncertainty, that open question at the heart of it, is what makes this one of the more quietly remarkable stories to come out of the relationship between the United States and Canada in a very long time. 250 maple trees are now going into American ground. What grows from them, politically, is the part none of us can predict. That is where I will leave it with you today, because the rest of this story is going to unfold slowly, in the trees taking root and in the negotiating room staying quiet or finally opening up. Thank you so much for watching all the way through this look at Canada's remarkable birthday gift to the United States and the tariff standoff sitting right underneath it. If a story like this, one that goes past the headline and digs into what is really happening between these two nations, is the kind of thing you want more of, then please take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so that the moment there is movement on these tariffs, on the trade talks, or on that 51st state rhetoric, you will be among the first to know. Your support genuinely helps, and I would love to have you here for whatever comes next. Until then, take care, stay curious, and I will see you in the next one.